The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
So you're an athlete sitting on the bench, not because you aren't good enough to compete, but because you were injured on the field of play. Now, what if that injury never should have happened? What if you never should have been on that field? Do you have rights? Will someone hear your plea for justice? Today's verdict will, so stay tuned because our show starts right now. Welcome to today's verdict, the show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney for the next 30 minutes, David Lesh. Being an athlete is both physically and mentally challenging, especially on the collegiate or professional level. You take a pounding on the field, and that many times will affect your long-term health. But do these athletes understand the risks involved in a sport, and just who is ultimately responsible when a player is injured in a game? On today's show, we're going to look at the term assumption of risk. It's an important area of the law, so let's hear how the website Law Info defines the defense assumption of risk.
When an accident occurs, the victims may be able to sue the person who caused the accident for damages. Depending on the injuries and the jurisdiction, the potential damage awards can be significant. However, if it can be proven that the victim assumed the risk of injury prior to the accident, then the case might be lost. Defendants often assert that the plaintiff assumed the risk of injury as a defense in a lawsuit. In order for it to be successful, it will have to be proven that the injured person knowingly and voluntarily accepted the risks involved prior to engaging in the activity. A simple example would be playing sports. When you play a soccer game, you knowingly and voluntarily accept the risk that you could be kicked on the field and possibly injured as a result. However, in personal injury lawsuits, whether an injured person assumed the risk of injury is usually a lot more complicated. Since the laws vary by state and all cases are different, you should contact an attorney for more information about how an assumption of the risk defense may apply in your situation.
Joining us in studio to help guide us through the risks we take on when we participate in a sport is attorney Sal Sokol of Kelly, Road and Kelly. Mr. Sokol, welcome to the show.
David, thank you for having me.
Assumption of risk. Your definition. Tell me what assumption of risk is.
David, you invited me here now because the school year is starting. Parents send their kids to school expecting that when the kid goes to school and plays in team sports, that the school will take responsibility for any harm or injury that comes to their kid. Unfortunately, David, it's not the case too often, and too many people take a bad pill when they find out that, in fact, it's not the school who's responsible, but it's the kid himself or the parent who's responsible for that kid's injury when playing in sport games.
Now, why is that? Parents say, look, I send my child to high school, or the child's in college, comes back with a couple of broken bones. What makes you think that defense is important? Why is that important to be able to shield the institution?
Okay, David, there is a flip side. And the flip side is that we want schools and other institutions to promote sports. We want that. We want team sports. We want kids to learn how to play sports. But that goes to a level. And the level is that kids, parents, participants have to know that they anticipate certain risks when they play the game. And that much, the school says this child, the student, is responsible for those injuries. Beyond that, anything beyond that is a whole other ballgame. Up until those risks that they encounter, those inherent risks in the game, the kid is responsible for that himself. After that, anything above that, the kid does not anticipate.
Well, let's give me an example of something that's over and above the inherent risk.
Take Ms. Weinberger. This is a case that went up to the highest court in New York State, the Court of Appeals. She was a pitcher in a game, and she was behind the L screen when she was practicing, preparing for the game. Lo and behold, the L screen was defective, and she got hurt. That defect that problem with the sports equipment that they gave her to protect her is not something that she assumed. That's something that the school was responsible for. That is something that the school would potentially have to pay for because it's not a risk that's assumed by the player.
I like the baseball reference because this show is going to have a little more baseball in it. But let's talk a little bit about one that goes the other way. The pitcher who's hit by a pitch, the male pitcher who's hit by the pitch, who also brings a lawsuit against the college and is not successful. What's the difference there?
It's a great question, David. The reason that was different than the case with the girl is because there was a story about lighting. They were inside a gym, and the court held, look, you know what? Upstate New York, where they can't play outside all year round, that a player who's on the team and anticipates that that's going to happen, that they're going to be playing inside, and they're not going to have all the benefits of an outdoor field. In that particular situation, the court says, "Look, give the school a break."
Right, because if you're going to be playing baseball for a college, you're going to know that during certain months you're going to be inside.
That's correct.
So, and you should understand the risks involved with that. Let me ask you a question. Let's talk a little bit. Let's switch to football for a little bit because it's all over the news. The concussions that occur. Are these NFL players assuming the risk of what later on could become, serious cognitive impairment? What's your opinion there?
David, it's a serious issue. The primary assumption of the risk, or what we're referring to as assumption of the risk, provides that the player knows what he's getting into. If the player doesn't know what he's getting into, and the risks are really greater than what he anticipates, that player has certain rights. And they might have rights above, and there will not be a defense applicable to that
So what
case.
you're saying, if the NFL knew or should have known that a certain amount of concussions would have led to dementia
Absolutely.
or something else, and didn't let the players know this, even though the players know that that it's a hard-hitting sport, the NFL may not be able to put forth the assumption of risk defense, correct?
Absolutely, David. It can go either way. It depends on what they know and what they should anticipate.
All right, let's give some tips to some parents who are watching now. You obviously want your child to participate in a sport. It's so important. What would you tell a parent who's watching right now and their child wants to go out there and play a contact sport?
Okay.
What advice would you give?
Okay. First of all, they have to know that that contact sports are dangerous, and that they're going to encounter dangerous situations, and kids can get hurt. But the kids should look out for things that are not in the ordinary, things that are extraordinary. If the equipment is not properly secure, if the equipment has a problem with it, if it's defective, anything like that, anything that is not anticipated, something that is extraordinary with regard to participating in the game, that's something that they are not responsible for. The child would not be responsible for. That's something that falls on the responsibility of the school, because the school is supposed to give them all their safety equipment in perfect working order.
So if you're playing lacrosse, for instance, and you're out there practicing and you get hit in the head and it's because they didn't give you a helmet, no assumption of risk defense, correct?
Absolutely.
So you have to, okay. Any final pieces of advice that you want to give to somebody in terms of this particular defense, in terms of how you can really protect yourself before we let you go?
Well, everybody should know that when they go and play these sports, contact sports or other types of sports, there are risks involved. They shouldn't be blind to the fact that there are risks involved.
Okay. And just because you get injured doesn't necessarily mean you have a lawsuit, right?
That's correct. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's the system that we live by.
Okay. Mr. Sokol, thanks for being here. I hope you come back.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, David.
We have to take a quick break, but coming up, we discuss the next place an athlete may be injured. Sadly, the hospital emergency room. We'll be right back.
This was me. And Mom and Dad. And my big brother Alex. And Jack. And this was the day that I learned that sandals get their name from sand. That jellyfish aren't made of jelly. That stars don't just come from the sky. That the ocean is bigger than all of us. This is the day we all got to forget that I was sick. And it changed everything. This was my wish.
I'm your host, David Lesh. Stay up to date with today's verdict by connecting with us and sending in your questions or comments through Facebook or Twitter using hashtag BXNETVER. On today's show, we've been discussing sports injuries both on and off the field. And when we say off the field, we are really talking about inadequate medical care. Who is responsible when a sports injury is made worse by a medical mistake? And here to assist us in answering our questions is Sean P. Kelly, a senior partner at Kelly, Road & Kelly. For over 30 years, Mr. Kelly has handled a broad range of civil litigation matters, focusing on the defense of medical and hospital malpractice matters. And Mr. Kelly, we're lucky to have you.
Thank you, Dave. Nice to be here.
All right, let's talk about the players in the emergency room. Who are we dealing with when we enter an emergency room?
An emergency room is a frightening experience for anybody who is brought there either by ambulance or walk-in or brought by a parent or loved one. The first person you're going to encounter is someone called the triage nurse. Could be a male or female. And that person is extremely important because that person will assess the severity of your presentation.
How do they do that? With numbers, letters?
Well, they take a history. Most importantly, they take a history. And they basically say, what brought you to the emergency room? And you have to speak clearly and completely as to why you're there, what ails you, what hurts you, and what were the circumstances that you felt it necessary to come to the emergency room. Now, at that point, that very important triage nurse, who is highly trained, will categorize you as between 1 and 4. And if you're a 1, or let's say you're a 4, that means the severity is very slight. You may not be seen for 2 or 3 hours or longer, depending upon the patient load on that particular day.
And that's why
evening.
If you're a 4, you could be spending 4 or 5 hours sitting in the waiting area.
But if you're 1, and she or he assesses you to be entitled to urgent care, they will fast-track you to the necessary personnel so that you are evaluated very quickly.
And who is that? Who's that next line of defense?
What happens is every person who is seen in the emergency room is assigned an attending physician, highly qualified emergency room physician who will have overall responsibility for you. Now, that person will also be assisted by maybe a resident, maybe a physician's assistant, maybe a fellow, but ultimately the attending physician is responsible for your care. And depending upon the severity of the complaint or the severity of the presentation, that attending physician will get involved. Now, if that attending physician feels that your care is so complex that they have to call in someone else, there is a roster of on-call physicians, specialists, who are on call 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, that are on a moment's notice. They will come to the emergency room and assess you further.
And then finally, you're admitted and you're there. You have people checking up on you. Am I correct? That's another line of defense. Who are they?
Okay, once you're admitted, you have to be admitted to the service of a physician. That physician then becomes your physician, and that physician is responsible for the overall management of your care. Now, that may be that you may be going to the emergency, you may be going to the operating room, you may be going to the ICU, or you may be admitted to the floor. You might need non-emergent surgery. But those assessments, those initial assessments, will be made in the emergency department, generally by the emergency room attending physician.
Okay, now there's a golden rule, am I correct?
Yes.
What do we mean by that?
Well, the golden rule, there are facilities that will literally send a mobile unit operating room to the field. We saw that in the battlefield. We see it now in aviation crashes. And in 1 hour's time, the severely compromised patient has to get some basic intervention or could risk their life. And that could be fluids, that could be antibiotics, that could be minor surgery, blood products. Otherwise, that patient has would not have an expectation to survive
and
that golden
how
hour.
long is it? So it's an hour, really.
Basically
you got an hour.
Basically an hour. But remember, in the normal situation, the patient is coming to the emergency room, and the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking. That triage nurse, one of the things he or she will say is, when did this accident happen? Was it 2 minutes ago or 45 minutes ago? And what is your how is your symptoms presented in that 45 minutes?
Because we don't want an irreversible damage to occur to one of these people.
Absolutely.
All right. The problems with emergency rooms, and it's all over the news, they're either understaffed, overworked. What is your opinion on what's going on?
You know, you have to remember, at any given day, at every given moment, there could be a mass casualty on the Long Island Expressway, or an airplane could go down, or there could be a multiple casualty. And that would overwhelm any system. But in the general sense, normally they are equipped. They're dedicated professionals, and they are equipped to handle multiple casualties.
Now,
but the system can be overwhelmed.
Well, let's be fair. You wear a particular hat every once in a while?
I do.
Your hat is a defense attorney.
Absolutely.
But mistakes do happen. Tell me some of the mistakes you've seen, at least, that or defended, should we say.
Okay. Well, what happens, unfortunately, occasionally, is they don't get the attending physician involved. The attending physician is not involved. For whatever reason, the patient doesn't require it, doesn't demand it, or the people who are working with the attending don't get him or her involved. And or they'll take an X-ray, and the X-ray will be read by the emergency room physician and not by a radiologist right away. And the emergency room physician wears multiple hats, and although he or she is good at interpreting X-rays, they're not as good as the radiologist.
Right.
So sometimes they could overlook something, and
which leads me to tips. People are watching. Get some advice to somebody who unfortunately may end up in and we all do. We're going to end up in an emergency room at some point. Probably.
I would say it's always good to go there with a friend, a loved one, a parent, someone else who's independent, who can act as a spokesperson for you. You may be compromised, you may be injured, you may be in pain, so you're not going to be the greatest historian. But if you're there with someone who was there at the time, that person can provide very valuable information. Secondly, I think it's a good idea to demand that you be seen by the attending physician. You're assigned a physician.
But can you demand that?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have the right? You have the right to do this?
You do. Now, again, it's depending upon the triage alignment. That doctor may be doing life-saving interventions in the next cubicle.
Yeah, but you
someone.
still have your golden rule of 60 minutes.
Right. But again, not everybody. That doesn't pertain to everyone.
Right.
So see your attending physician, and then follow the directions, the discharge instructions to the letter. And many people just overlook that. There are specific instructions that are given to the patient, and that they should do as far as follow-up care.
Sean, great advice.
Thanks, Steve.
But when we return, we will continue discussing medical mistakes following a sports injury. We'll be right back.
Being a dad can be tough.
No. What do you mean she's not coming?
When's the fairy princess coming?
Any minute now.
But when you're willing to do anything...
It is I, Groogs Zinkelpel. Okay, time for cake.
It's always worth it.
I know it's really you, Gru. I'm just pretending for the other kids.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today. Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov.
Long before I was in Hollywood, I had a grandmother by the name of Estelle Marie Tanner. Positive role models to make sure that I was on the straight path. Big Brothers Big Sisters carefully screens volunteers and places them in long-term mentoring matches with kids who face adversity. With more volunteers, especially men, and more donations, every little who needs a big can have it. Start something. If it's been a while since you've been involved, start something again. Learn more at bigbrothersbigsisters.org.
Welcome back. I'm your host, David Lesh. Remember that our show is here to serve you, our viewers. So don't forget to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and tell us what topics or questions you'd like us to cover on the show. We've been talking sports, specifically injuries that occur on the field, as well as later in the day in the emergency room. Some sports injuries, though, are just downright embarrassing, and we thought you would like to see the top 10 most embarrassing sports injuries ranked by alltime10.com. Getting hurt and not getting the proper medical treatment can have a lasting effect on a person's quality of life. Joining us in the studio as our medical expert is orthopedic surgeon Dr. Stuart Hirschon. Dr. Hirschon has been the New York Yankees team physician since 1988 and is currently in an advisory role with the team. And guess what? He was also an athlete himself, playing the positions of tight end and wide receiver for Harvard University, and we're happy and lucky to have him on the show. Doctor, it's a pleasure. Been looking forward to meeting you, really have.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about how you got into the business of becoming an orthopedic surgeon.
I got into the business of being an orthopedic surgeon involved in sports medicine because I was always involved with sports ever since I was a little boy, high school, college, and wanted to be a doctor, and it seemed to be a good fit. And when I went to college, I came under was tutored, and I had a mentor named Dr. Quigley, Barton Quigley, and he was the Harvard team physician for all sports, including football, and that's how I got to know him. And he was a father of sports medicine back a long time ago.
Well, I'm sure with the Yankees you've seen your share of injuries. What types of injuries are you treating the Yankees for when you see the Yankees?
Well, when I was treating the Yankees on an everyday basis, most of the injuries in baseball are attritional type injuries, overuse. You do have occasional collisions. People run into walls, run into each other, get hit by balls and bats, but most of the injuries are overuse, shoulder, elbow, knee, that occur over a period of time.
And just for the average athlete who watches, generally what type of what type of rest or what do you need to rehabilitate yourself if you have an injury that either to the shoulder or to the knee?
It depends on the severity of the injury. You can have a minor injury, you can just tweak a muscle, feel something, and you can recover in a few days, or it can be a much more major problem where a tendon is either partially torn or completely torn. Those problems either need rehab, sometimes invasive treatment like injections, medication, and sometimes surgery.
It seems that more and more often the athletes are actually getting back on the field much faster than before.
That's right.
And performing just as well, if not better. Is that medicine? Is it just the athletes are bigger and stronger or healthier?
It's a combination of things.
Okay.
On the medical side, to start at the top, if you will, technology has improved tremendously in the last 30 or 40 years. Arthroscopic surgery, for instance. There are a lot of ball players in baseball, for instance, and football who would have ordinarily been out of the sport if they hadn't had the advantage of arthroscopic surgery. So that's been a big advancement. And then there's nutrition, there's training, conditioning. All that makes a big difference.
I would assume also the medical facilities have changed at the actual stadiums too. Am I correct? You have the MRIs and the X-ray machines and everything.
Absolutely. You have technology that's really advanced in most stadiums. Not necessarily MRI, but X-ray certainly, and really good technical support.
Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about injuries that occur while playing a sport. Not necessarily on the professional level, the collegiate level, or in high school. What's the biggest danger that you see to kids who are playing these types of sports? Is it that they don't stretch? Is they not qualified? What do you think?
I think when it depends on the age. If you're talking about young children, and by the way, today, kids get into sports at a very early age compared to, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Not only that, but they're playing the sport and practicing the sport all year. One sport, for the most part. So if you take an athlete in high school, for instance, 30 or 40 years ago, he might be a good athlete. He would be playing football in the fall or soccer, basketball in the winter, baseball, maybe track. Today, if the boy or the girl, it's one sport, and it's all year. That leads to these overuse, repetitive type attritional injuries.
Okay, I want to talk football for a second.
Sure.
Okay, it's in the news. A lot of these lawsuits are going to claim that the NFL knew or really should have known that the concussions that many have suffered in the past while playing football is leading to severe cognitive impairment. What are your thoughts on the issue?
It's a complicated issue. It really is. I mean, first of all, you have to, in order for this really to be proven, you have to really come down with real hard evidence and numbers. And that would mean, are there now out there men who played football professionally, not including college and high school, but professional football players, because they played for a longer period of time, who suffered concussions that are now suffering from dementia in a greater proportion than the normal population. And that information is really not solid yet. And that's one of the problems. But again, there is the assumption of risk issue that's been discussed earlier. And football players know when they get into this that they're going to get hit in the head. It's part of the game.
Absolutely.
And it's something that people assume as risk. And as a professional, if you're going to earn your living that way, you pretty much know what you're getting into.
Well, Dr. Hirschman, I want to thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Well, it's a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, that's all for tonight. It's time to deliberate. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and, of course, you for watching. Remember, if there's a legal issue or topic you would like to see on the show, email me at davidlesh@bronxnet.org. And until we see you again, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach a verdict. We'll see you next time.
Underneath everything we are, underneath everything we do, we are all people, connected, interdependent, united. And when we reach out a hand to one, we can influence the condition of all. That's what it means to live united.